Next on KQED Newsroom, President Obama visits California's Central Valley, pledging to help farmers affected by the drought. Plus, a look at how the endangered Coho salmon are faring.
The drought means low flows, low water levels in the creek.
Pedestrian fatalities on the rise. Why are Bay Area streets so dangerous? And a look back on 10 years of the same-sex marriage debate in San Francisco and beyond.
And look where we are. 10 years from now, we could have never imagined we would be where we are now.
Good evening and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. The current drought is threatening as much as 500,000 acres of California's richest farmland. President Obama, along with Governor Jerry Brown, visited the Central Valley this afternoon to see the drought's impact in person.
California is our biggest economy. California is our biggest agricultural producer. So what happens here matters to every working American, right down to the cost of food that you put on your table.
The president pledged millions of dollars in federal aid, and Scott Shafer has been following the developments, and he joins us now. Hi, Scott.
Hi, Thuy.
Well, what did the president offer in terms of drought relief aid?
Well, the president offered a package of about $183 million. It's not new money. A lot of it was in the farm bill that he just signed. The big ticket items, $100 million for livestock disaster assistance, and really streamlining the program. It sometimes takes ranchers up to a year to get money in their pockets. They're promising that'll be scaled down to 2 months. $60 million for food banks in the region, and if you think about it, the farmers, their families, as well as farm workers are going to be hurting as this drought goes on, and so that'll help provide some food to those folks who are out of work or just struggling to make ends meet.
And some money for conservation efforts as well.
Absolutely. And some of this, let's be honest, it was a photo op for the president. Democrats are kind of back on their heels a little bit on this issue. And of course, what they really need is more rain. And the president can't bring that, neither can the governor or anyone else, but at least he can show that he's concerned and meet with all the right people and all the stakeholders and show, in fact, that Washington is paying attention.
And President Obama did spend a fair amount of time talking about climate change. What did he say about that exactly?
Well, he did. And, this rural America is not real excited about the idea of climate change. In fact, Devin Nunes, who's the Republican Congress member from this area, calls it absolute nonsense. But the president said that although you can't blame any particular weather event on climate change, that it is leading to extreme weather, and we have to be ready for that. He pointed out that California's water wars in the past have been a zero-sum game. That's got to change. But he said that we really need to get a hold on carbon emissions. Until we do that, he said, and as scientists would mostly agree, there's going to be more extreme conditions in terms of rain, floods, fires, and all the rest.
And he's proposing a $1 billion climate resilience program. How are Republicans likely to receive that? And how do you think his visit here will affect the response to the drought by lawmakers?
Well, he did set up these climate hubs, which are basically research areas to help farmers and farms become more resilient in the face of all this extreme weather. This issue, like virtually everything else in Washington, Thuy, has become very partisan. Republicans blame the drought on Democrats. They say that this is largely the result of environmental policies, specifically the Endangered Species Act. And Democrats say we're not eliminating the Endangered Species Act. That's a non-starter. The Republicans in the House passed a bill to loosen environmental laws. That's not going to go anywhere. So they're going to have to find something, if they can find anything, to agree on. But the president's visit today is really, like I said, about showing the flag, giving a little support to Democrats who are, somewhat vulnerable on this issue.
And you mentioned the bill passed by House Republicans, and Democrats countered this week with Senators Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer. They proposed their own drought relief package.
They did, and of course it isn't going to change the Endangered Species Act. It's about a $300 million package of support for farmers. It would make it easier, give water agencies more flexibility to move water around so that they could get it to places that are severely hit by this drought.
Governor Brown has been talking about the drought this week. He was with the president today in Fresno. He hasn't always been perceived as a friend of agriculture. So what is he saying about all this?
Well, you're right. He hasn't been. I mean, if those who remember the first time he was governor, there was the medfly, and Rose Bird, his Chief Justice, was not friendly to agriculture at all. He's been pretty vague this week. He was very critical of what the House Republicans did, saying it was just very divisive and doesn't do anything to solve the problems. But he also said, you know, I can't make it rain. And he said, we just need to talk, and this is going to require political jawboning to try to find some common ground. But he's been very unspecific about what that means.
A state Senate committee this week passed a water bond to put on the ballot. What is he saying about that?
Well, he's trying to avoid saying much of anything because there was an $11 billion water bond passed in 2009. That was loaded up with all kinds of pork projects, bike lanes and everything else, and they know that that isn't going to fly with voters. So now this week they passed a much slimmer version, $7 billion. There's another proposal out there floating around in the Assembly, but the governor seems very reluctant to put it on the ballot. He said, look, whether I support it or not doesn't matter if voters don't support it. And so he's being very cautious. I talked to Senator Feinstein this week, and she really is saying, look, the governor is doing well no matter what is on the ballot with him, and he ought to really put these bonds on the ballot because now is the time.
Well, but he's also, if you believe what's put out there, is probably going to run for re-election, and he probably doesn't want to put a bond on the ballot right now.
Right, especially when you're running as I'm the guy that cleaned up all the budget problems and living within our means and all the rest.
Yeah, sure. Well, Scott, thank you for that update and
bet.
the analysis.
Thank you.
Well, the drought is taking a toll not only on fields and farms, but also on fish, including the endangered coho salmon. Low water levels have prevented many adult California coho from reaching their spawning grounds in creeks like Lagunitas in Marin County. Last weekend's rain brought a measure of relief, raising water levels enough to allow some salmon through. But as reporter Dan Brekke found, the relief may be temporary.
Every fall, the first big rains of the season draw coho salmon back to Lagunitas Creek in western Marin County. With only a few hundred adult coho returning here annually to spawn, these fish are fighting for survival. And now they face a new threat, California's drought. Hey there. To find out how the fish are doing, I met up with Greg Andrew, a fish biologist with the Marin Municipal Water District, and his intern, Rosa Albanese.
We got some waders for you, and you can put these on. We'll keep you dry while we walk through the creek.
They let me join them on a survey to track fresh spawning activity in Lagunitas Creek, one of the last strongholds for wild coho salmon on the Central Coast.
Right away, Dan, we've got two nest sites here where the female has laid her eggs and the male has fertilized those.
I gave Greg a hand measuring this spawning nest site called a red.
That's good. Doesn't have to be exactly there, but pretty close. 7.2.
Normally, the coho in the Lagunitas watershed finish spawning in mid-January, but the drought has actually changed the fish's behavior by pushing the spawning season well into February.
What that tells me is that those fish were out in Tomales Bay holding and just waiting. And this is the first time we've actually seen this happen.
The fish waited for a big storm, a much-needed event that came last week when more than a foot of rain soaked Marin County. That deluge prompted 100 coho to surge into the creek to spawn and then die.
So, Dan, this is a coho carcass.
Beautiful.
Spawn and die.
As Rosa and Greg take measurements and tissue samples, I'm reminded that even in death, this coho is a critical link in the ecosystem carrying nutrients into the soil to nourish towering redwoods at the water's edge. As we head upstream, we finally get a glimpse of these remarkable fish and their struggle to pass on their DNA.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Use your binoculars and get a good look at those guys.
Two brawny males push and bite each other to get access to a nearby female, waiting for a chance to fertilize her eggs. We even spot another threatened species of fish, a steelhead trout.
So far to date, we have counted about 165 coho reds in Lagunitas Creek, and we've seen close to 300 coho salmon. That's a good number, and just a week ago we had less than half that.
The Marin Municipal Water District releases water year-round to help not only migrating adult coho, but also the young that live here for more than a year before swimming out to sea. But with the drought, the reservoirs are well below capacity.
The drought means low flows, low water levels in the creek, which is bad for any fish, and certainly bad for the coho salmon of California.
With steps ranging from building debris structures to provide a refuge for fish, to the state's recent ban on fishing in coastal streams, the fight to save the coho for future generations presses ahead.
These are fish that don't belong to me or you or the people of Marin County. They are a resource to the state of California. They belong to the people of California. And I think people view the status of the population as an indicator of the health of their own environment. As the salmon go, so goes their environment, and so goes their state of well-being living here in California.
Pedestrian deaths continue to be in the news following this week's fatal crash in San Francisco on Van Ness Avenue. There were 21 such fatalities in San Francisco in 2013. It was also a particularly deadly year in San Jose, with 26 fatal pedestrian accidents, the highest number in nearly 2 decades. What's behind the spike? Joining me now for a look at what can be done to curb the problem are Nicole Schneider, Executive Director of Walk San Francisco, and Chris Huang, Board President of Walk Oakland, Bike Oakland. Thank you both for being here. Nicole, I wanted to ask you, first of all, why are the number of pedestrian deaths rising in large cities like San Francisco, like San Jose?
You know, we don't really know exactly why they're rising over the last year, for instance, but we know what the solutions are. So we're really focused on, making progress and making a change right now.
Could things like technology, the use of mobile devices, be to blame? What about, the economy's picking up, more people are on the roads? Could those be factors as well, Chris?
I have no idea, but I know that for many, many decades, we've been designing our cities to bring cars through the streets as quickly as possible. And that has been a priority, and I think that that concept and priority is truly outdated and needs to be fixed.
So what is truly the cause? You mentioned some of the environmental and the roadway factors, but is it primarily a case of drivers not being careful enough, or are pedestrians to blame in a fair number of these accidents as well?
In San Francisco, we found that 66% of the time, the fault is the driver's fault in terms of a collision, and pedestrians are at fault the rest of the time. And this is in terms of police data. But I think when we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, this is the city's responsibility. When in the last 10 weeks in San Francisco, 11 people were struck and killed trying to cross the street. This is a crisis that the city needs to take responsibility for. So we know how to solve these problems. We know that the city can prevent these traffic collisions from happening. So rather than, I think, figuring out who's to blame, we're trying to take a step back and look at how we can prevent them from happening.
And the reality is that we are going to have more people in cities. That is where we're headed towards. And I think it's a great thing to have more people in cities. It makes our cities more vibrant. There are great neighborhoods where it's great to see people around, and it's much more fun. And I think that that's what we have to work with. And this is our new reality, and we need to work towards a good solution that is economically sustainable and viable for all users of the roadway.
So there have been a number of things that have been done. For example, some cities have widened their sidewalks. In San Francisco, if you drive on Market Street, you can see the bike lanes are now painted a bright green so that it's easier to see. What else do cities need to do?
In San Francisco, we partnered with a group of community coalitions, and including the Bike Coalition, to work with the city to adopt what's called Vision Zero, and that's zero traffic fatalities in 10 years. And we're doing that through enforcement, engineering safer streets, and educating the public and paid drivers especially, engaging our community activists, community residents around these issues, and then evaluating our progress. So we call it the 5 E's. And in terms of engineering, we think that's the biggest piece. And it's slow down traffic. We know that when traffic is at 40 miles per hour, pedestrians that are hit by cars have a 5% chance of living. At 20 miles per hour, if you're hit by a car as a pedestrian, you have an 85% chance of living.
So a huge difference there.
It's a huge difference. So but just by slowing down traffic, we can save lives.
And there are plenty of neighborhood planning groups out there, and every capital improvement project that goes through the city of Oakland has to go through some traffic analysis. So one of the first things we're asking the city to do is to update the traffic analysis techniques and to really implement what they have recently adopted as the Complete Streets policy. And that is designing streets and roadways so that it's safe and comfortable for all users of the roadway. This is something that we've learned nationally as best practice. It's a framework that California actually adopted in 2008, and I think that we're catching on. And it requires advocacy groups like Walk Oakland, Bike Oakland to really chase down the planners and the traffic engineers to follow through.
So far we've been talking about deaths, we've been talking about pedestrian deaths, but bicyclists die as a result of these collisions as well. And even though the number of deaths are in the dozens, when we talk about injuries, it significantly increases to hundreds of people. What is it like in San Francisco in terms of the number of pedestrians and bicyclists injured?
Yeah, in San Francisco, we know that 3 pedestrians are hit by cars a day. If you look at a day. And if you look at San Francisco General Hospital's trauma center, 1 in 4 patients are victims of traffic crimes. So they're pedestrians who have been hit by cars. 1 in 4.
That's an astounding statistic. The Center for Investigative Reporting did a big report on this, and one of the things that San Francisco DA George Gascon said in their report was that reckless driving injures hundreds and hundreds of people a year. And if we had this many people being shot every year, people would be jumping up and down. And in his mind, reckless driving is just as bad as people using a firearm recklessly. So why is it, do you think, that pedestrian deaths and roadway safety often isn't at the top of people's list of concerns when we're talking about other things like the economy, perhaps, or the drought?
I think for, at least in San Francisco, it's a culture that we've got around driving where we assume that it's an accident when somebody gets hit by a car. When a driver hits somebody, it's just an accident. They didn't mean to do it. But really, if we take a step back and look at, were they speeding? Were they distracted? What's the situation in the roadway? Was the intersection lit? Is the roadway too wide? How's the street design? So we're actually starting to shift that culture through Vision Zero, and the police department actually took accident out of their vocabulary, and they're now using the word collision because we know that in every situation somebody is at fault. And this is coming back to the point that these collisions are preventable; they're not accidents.
Even so, with the change in the collision language, are the penalties for these accidents heavy enough? Because back in 1945, the laws changed. It used to be just a manslaughter statute, but then the California lawmakers put into place something called vehicular manslaughter. The range of sentences for that was reduced. You could also have the option of making it a misdemeanor and not a felony. Are the penalties severe enough?
And I don't know. I don't think that I think that if you hit someone from behind the wheel of a car, just because you're behind the wheel of a car, it doesn't mean that you didn't kill somebody. We're working with the police department to arrest people who hit and kill other people or hit and injure other people. Actually, until last month, the police department didn't even cite people who hit and injured people as drivers. So in one instance, a woman was walking across the street and another driver ran a red light, hit her. She was in the ICU for a month. Severe, disability as a result. And the driver walked away scotch-free, no penalties at all. This story, and this story was shared with the police department at a hearing last month, and the police department actually changed their practice. So now they're actually citing people. But is that enough? I don't think so.
So does it seem like there's enough progress in terms of city lawmakers coming around?
Well, I think that there is definitely movement and there's desire to change the way we think about planning our cities. I think what we also miss by focusing a lot on collision data is what's not being recorded. And it's that even in roadways where there aren't any collisions recorded, people still do not feel safe walking. And I think that's a problem.
Okay. Well, definitely a serious problem, as you both have made very clear. Nicole Schneider and Chris Huang, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On this Valentine's Day, a landmark anniversary celebrated at San Francisco City Hall.
4,036 couples came together to do something no more extraordinary than this, just say, I do. And it was a celebration of the most powerful and important thing in life, and that's love.
It was 10 years ago when then Mayor of San Francisco, Gavin Newsom, began issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples at City Hall, triggering years of wrangling in the courts and at the ballot box. Last year, the U.S. Supreme Court had the final say, invalidating Prop 8 and restoring gay marriage in California. It also struck down part of the Federal Defense of Marriage Act. The legal landscape and public opinion have been rapidly changing. Now 17 states allow gay marriage. And just yesterday, Virginia became the latest state to have its ban on same-sex marriage struck down by a federal judge. Kate Kendall with the National Center for Lesbian Rights has been involved in marriage equality litigation for years. She spoke with Scott Shafer earlier today.
Kate Kendall, welcome and happy Valentine's Day.
To you as well, Scott. Thank you.
Think back a decade, 2004, this week, February, pandemonium, euphoria at City Hall. But also concern about where it was leading. Did you ever think we'd be where we are today, 10 years later, with 17 states allowing same-sex marriage and all the rest?
Never, never. I knew that we were starting something big and that it was going to cascade in some way. What I couldn't have imagined was the accelerant that it would be to people coming to an understanding about the reality of the lives of same-sex couples and LGBT people. It really was, with the benefit of hindsight now, 10 years hindsight, a groundbreaking moment.
What do you think, what was it about that time that, that really triggered everything that followed?
Well, you know, I think at that time, in 2004, there was still a huge division. If you were Republican and conservative, you were opposed to the idea of same-sex couples getting married or to gay rights generally. If you were liberal or progressive and a Democrat, you were in favor. And what's happened in the 10 years since is that that dividing line has totally melted away. Now, of course, you still have, you know, some factions, but many Republicans support marriage equality. Many conservatives, self-described conservatives, support gay rights. It truly provided a lens, I think, through which people could examine their own stereotypes or their prejudices that I think maybe nothing else would have.
There were many ups and downs. In fact, those initial marriages were invalidated by the state Supreme Court. Was there a moment that you, as you think back on it, that was the low point? Oh,
well, the passage of Prop 8. You know, when I stood on the Supreme Court steps when we won the decision and we had marriage in California and the right of same-sex couples to marry had been affirmed, that was probably the zenith of my career, and certainly the nadir of my career was when Prop 8 passed. That was the lowest moment I can imagine in my professional life.
And yet, as you recall, there were a lot of LGBT legal groups that opposed challenging Prop 8 in the federal courts. And in fact, gay rights advocates had avoided the federal courts. Right. So that was a roll of the dice, wasn't it?
Well, you know, at the time, we felt like the idea of Ted Olson and David Boies,
the two attorneys who
challenged Prop 8 federally, their involvement felt to us like a real game changer. But everyone knew that when you take a case to the U.S. Supreme Court, you're talking big stakes. Yeah. And and we weren't sure how things were going to play out. But I think Ted Olson and David Boies being involved helped ignite and dissolve some of that dividing line between who was in favor and who was against.
You know, as we all know, President Obama has evolved famously on this issue, and he's now taking a very aggressive role.
Yep.
What difference do you think it's made to have the first African-American president coming out so strongly, not only just for gay rights, but linking it to the civil rights struggle?
Well, I think it's been a huge momentum changer, and I think it had a lot to do with why in November of 2012 we won 4 states when marriage was on the ballot. We'd never won a popular election before. And I think what Obama's coming out in favor of marriage for same-sex couples did is it, you know, as long as people see the government discriminating, they don't have to examine their own private prejudices, because all they have to say is, well, look, the government doesn't think they should marry. That's good enough for me. Obama coming out and making his statement so publicly made people think, well, now how do I really feel about this issue? And examining that, any prejudice helps to ameliorate it.
You, of course, were on the losing side of a lot of struggles. Now it's gone the other way. Do you ever feel sorry or feel empathy for the people who are, you know, now supporting the bans that are falling one by one across the country?
Well, I don't feel any empathy for the anti-gay establishment, for individuals who make their living by vilifying and demonizing the LGBT community. But because I grew up Mormon in Utah, I certainly do feel empathy for individuals who feel like something that they don't understand and that they're afraid of is happening, and they're feeling threatened by it. Those are the folks we need to be always willing to have a conversation with.
Last question on this Valentine's Day. Do you think that the struggle for full equality has in any way affected the commitment that gay and lesbian couples feel for each other?
Gosh, that is such a great question. I have to think that the intense focus on why we want to marry, why anyone wants to marry, that you want to marry because of love, because of commitment, does have many same-sex couples thinking more seriously about who they mean to each other, who we are to each other, and makes us feel part of a larger culture where we actually want to embrace the values of commitment and love and be a part of a bigger human family, when before we just stiff-armed the human family because the human family was stiff-arming us.
Extraordinary change.
And one to celebrate every day.
All right, Kate Kendall, thanks so much for coming in.
My pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
And that does it for tonight. For all of KQED's news coverage, please go to kqednews.org. I'm Thuy Vu. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good night.